Hey, thanks for joining us for Deep Dive. Deep Dive is a time when we go back for a second look at the sermon and look at some passages in greater detail, or maybe we talk about something that didn't make it into the sermon. And on May 7th, we started a new series called The Way, and it's looking at 8 practices that Jesus models and gives us for following his way of living so that we can discover life in the fullest. And in the first week, we talked about the practice of solitude, about getting alone with Jesus so we can hear what he has to say. And I talked about 3 benefits to the practice of solitude. The first was that in solitude, we redefine our attachments. The second was in solitude, we deal with our insecurities. And in solitude with God, we find direction for what is next. I want to go back to that first 2 reasons and talk about our attachments and our insecurities. And I want to talk about 3 lies that actually lie underneath those attachments and those insecurities. And we see these lies actually displayed in Luke chapter 4 as Jesus goes into the wilderness. We read in the first verse that Jesus, full of the Spirit, is led by the Spirit into the wilderness, into solitude. And while he is in solitude, he's fasting and praying. He says, you know what, being alone with God and hearing from God is more important than me eating or being with other people. That's what solitude, fasting, and praying is all about. And as he's doing this, the enemy of our soul, the devil, comes to tempt Jesus. And he presents Jesus with 3 lies that actually fuel insecurities and cause us to attach to things that are unhealthy for us. The first of those lies is the lie of power. You see, the enemy comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, you are so hungry right now. Why don't you turn those stones into bread? And this is the lie of power. It says that you are only as good as the power you wield or the control that you have. And the reason why this is such a temptation is because we're told in Scripture in Philippians 2 that Jesus is fully human and fully God, but he gave up his divine rights, freely gave these up to become human and become like you and me. And so the enemy comes and he says, Jesus, why don't you take back that power? Because you are only as good as the power you have. And why don't you turn those stones into bread? Because God clearly has abandoned you. That's what the enemy is saying. And you know, sometimes when we feel abandoned, a lot of times we try to control things and we try to power up so that we feel like we are safe and secure even though we've been abandoned. That's the lie of power. And Jesus refutes that. And then the enemy takes Jesus up to a high place so that he can see all of the kingdoms of the world. And he says to Jesus, who he knows is the Messiah, the King of the Jews, he says to Jesus, I will give you all of these kingdoms if you will bow down and worship me. And what the enemy is saying to Jesus, he's saying, you know what, Jesus, you are only as good as your last success. And the enemy knows that Jesus is the King of the Jews, but he says, I will give you much more than just the Jews. I will give you everything if you worship me. This is the lie of performance. That you are only as good as your last A, or you're only as good as the last success you had on a project. And that people don't really like you unless you are successful. And we give in to this lie, and it becomes something that says people will like me, or I will feel better about myself if I just do more, or if I just do better at something. And this lie comes up through workaholism. This lie comes up by never being satisfied through perfectionism in everything. And it causes us to have insecurities, and it causes us to attach to things to find emotional stability and security in places that we're never meant to attach to. And Jesus again refutes this lie as well. And then the third lie that comes up is the lie of pleasing, of people pleasing. And Jesus is taken up to a high place in Jerusalem, to the top of the temple, and the enemy says to him, Jesus, why don't you throw yourself down to the ground? Because it says in the Bible that God will rescue you, protect you. But will he really? And he puts this doubt in Jesus' mind. And this is the lie that God really doesn't love you. And that's a complete lie, and Jesus realizes it, and he refutes this as well. And a lot of times when we are people pleasers, we will abandon our agenda, we will abandon our goals, we will abandon our own integrity in order to please somebody else. We will do whatever it is. If it's our spouse, we will do whatever we can to make them happy, and if they are ever upset with us, it destroys us inside. That is the lie of people pleasing. that you are only good if you're loved by the right people. And Jesus refutes all of these lies, and it's possible for him to refute these lies because of the time he spent in solitude. You see, in solitude, Jesus is able to hear that his value is not dependent on the power that he wields or the performance that he gives or the people that he pleases, but it's based on what the Father says about him. And if we remember on Sunday, I talked about what happens just before Jesus goes into the wilderness is this incredible identity scene where Jesus is baptized, and as he's coming up out of the water, we hear the Father say, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." That is the essence, that is the core of Jesus' identity. And the Spirit comes upon him in something that looks like a dove, and the Spirit conveys that identity and confirms that identity within Jesus. And the wilderness is where Jesus actually becomes settled in who he is. And you and I need to embrace this solitude, this practice of solitude, because every day these lies are at work inside of us. There's probably one that's dominant in your life right now. And in solitude, you will find the dominant one. But here's the thing, when you whack that one down, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. If you've ever played that game, you play that game whack-a-mole, and you hit one down and another one pops up, right? This is how it is with these identity lies of power and pleasing and performance. You deal with one and another one pops up. And it's only through a daily ritual of solitude that you can actually deal with the lies that the enemy is throwing at you. And the way that we deal with the lies is by hearing what God has to say to us. And we speak the truth against the lie that the enemy speaks. And that's what Jesus does throughout his temptation, is he quotes Scripture back to the enemy, so that the truth combats the lies, and the identity, his true identity as the Son of God, is rooted within him. That's why solitude is so important in our lives. There's a lot of things we can attach to. There's a lot of things that we can look to find security in life, but they are not lasting. It is only through solitude, being alone with God, that we actually discover the truth of who we are, what God says about us, that can refute the lies that will, in time, destroy us. But Jesus came so that we might have life and have it to the fullest. That is the practice of solitude. That is the promise that Jesus gives to us if we get alone with him in the wilderness of life. Thanks for watching Deep Dive. If you have any comments, leave them down below. If you have any questions, leave them down below. If you like this, or if this was helpful to you, be sure to like it and share it on your social profiles, because this can help somebody else as well who's dealing with these 3 identity lies. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.